ancient battles were never fought in forests. Not intentionally, at least, and certainly not in the typical way we've been covering so far on this channel. Hello senators and legates, welcome to Total War Tactics. We are gonna be taking a closer look at forest battles today. As you can see, we're going to be doing this in Rome 2 with the Divide Et Impera mod enabled. We're going to be covering the usual stuff as always, and we're gonna have Heroes of the Greeks, a friend and fellow Total War creator, with me as my reliable companion for today. If there are any parts of the video you want to see, there are timestamps in the description for you to use. But with that said, let's introduce the tactic. Historically, ancient kingdoms and city-states tried to avoid confrontations in forests or rocky terrain in general. This is mostly due to ancient warfare being fought with an extra focus on coordination and unity within the individual armies themselves. The Macedonians and Romans are just two of the many examples of this being the case, with both preferring to fight on open terrain. Another reason why ancient kingdoms didn't want to fight in forests is due to logistical problems. Baggage trains and supplies would have a much harder time reaching the right location and could just cause more trouble than it was worth. Instead, woods and trees would usually be used for foraging or encamping to stay hidden from the enemy. The Romans are, as always, one of the main examples of this, as they form fortifications on a regular basis. But going back to the topic at hand, if there ever was a battle in a forest, it would closer represent an ambush or guerrilla warfare. The best example of this is of course the famous Battle of Teutoburg Forest. Here the Romans were lured into the woods to get faced with countless attacks over the set of 3 days. All because the Romans failed to discover the German forces in time. And other reasons of course. At times, commanders would hide a small contingent of their forces in a nearby forest to get an advantage in combat, but that should also be the extent of ancient forest battles and their usage. In modern day, these can yield great cover and a strong defensive position for infantry and machine gun nests to shoot from. They can basically be called natural fortresses, as the attacker will almost always experience the most casualties. That is almost always the case when it comes to modern warfare. So, even though they weren't that usual in history, they're still possible to experience in Total War. In my opinion, they actually give the best example of realistic battles, as you don't know how deep or wide your opponent's lines are until you are about to engage. With that, we're gonna try to win these kinds of battles in the exact opposite way of how the Romans would approach this, with ambushes and scouting. On the Teutoburg Forest map, the one we will be fighting on today, there are plenty of valleys and cliffs to grant cover on the flanks. Just like the Germanics knew, it is perfect for ambushing. We can position our archers on the cliffs, block the path with our spearmen, and appear from behind with our swords, axes and mounted units. That is the overall plan, as you can't really make a tactical plan before you know exactly where your opponents are. Therefore, we will also have our cavalry ahead of our formation to scout the forest. Let me just give you a few tips on when you fight on dense forest maps. Number 1. Scouting. Knowing your opponent's formation and location is key to victory. Number 2 is appear weak where you are actually strong, because if you see the majority of the enemy forces moving towards one of your hidden flanking units, I suggest revealing units like infantry or archers to make your enemy believe your main core is somewhere else. The third tip is to attempt to hit his flank with everything you have before enemy reinforcements can arrive. And also before we move on, I would like to give a quick shout out to Johnny the Dumpling for telling me how to play on this map. He's a smaller channel, so please go over to him and give him some love. With that said, let's pick the army. As we are playing on the Teutoburg Forest map, Heroes of the Greeks and I agreed to pick Germanic and Roman factions with me as my beloved Kinbri. We will have elite stalk cavalry so they can escape into thin air or hold their own if they get caught. 3 spears to hold different choke points throughout the battlefield. 3 archers to take advantage on the cliffs. 5 different units with the scare ability to break enemy forces, and a few axemen to make the initial charge of any flanking maneuver. There's not much else to this, so let the chaos commence. This battle ended up being much longer than anticipated, so we will stick to the tactical overview. In the beginning, we both sent out cavalry to scout the field, but his cav is running straight for our shock infantry, so I revealed most of our infantry on the far right to divert his focus. In the meantime, our scouts actually run straight into the nest of Romans. Getting the jump on one of their cavalry units, we took the fight. But as more of his infantry started to engage us, we pulled out and disappeared into the forest. On our side though, his Javcav continued to harass our infantry. Knowing our deceit of infantry didn't work, we reformed all of our units on that side to plan our next attack. Knowing most of his units was on that side too, I planned to encircle his cavalry with our supposed superior numbers. But as the battle started, we realized he had even more infantry here. It was a failed ploy that cost me most of our cavalry. However, he didn't give up the chase, so we took them on a small hike throughout the countryside to meet our general and shock infantry. But although this was a catastrophic loss, I had finally received all the intel I needed to make my ambush. Knowing he had most of his infantry in this small valley flanked by the 2 cliffs, and a smaller force on the hill opposite of us, I could send our shock infantry up the same way of which our cavalry just came from, block the units from the valley off with our spears, and focus down the units on the hill. To make sure our shock infantry could cross the road unseen, I sent our last cav unit to the opposite side with skirmishers to give protection. Knowing the coast was clear, we moved forward with our plan. Here you can see the stats from the battle. I was surprised to see how few units heroes of the Greeks actually brought to the field. But with them being so expensive, it makes sense. Overall, it was most likely our numbers that scored us the victory, but our flanking maneuver worked, giving us the glory today. Against the AI where I gave the Romans a complete army, we utterly encircled them in the valley and crushed them from all sides with our cavalry, shock infantry and axemen. There isn't really that much to say here, as this was pretty much a decisive victory. Look at the stats if you'd like, but other than that, let us move on. In terms of how to defeat ambush tactics like this one in a forest, it all comes down to how well you know your enemy. I can't say enough how important scouting is in these kinds of scenarios. If you figure out where your opponent wants to ambush you, you can make a plan to turn it to your advantage, basically ambushing another ambush. If you want to move forward, I suggest doing this as a united force and not with incredible long distances between each other, so you can always be reinforced by other units. With that said, a small vanguard to take the first hit could always be an option, with your main firepower being kept in reserve till it is safe. There isn't much else to it. Which also leads over to my final verdict. Forest battles all come down to how much experience in fighting in such environments you have. Of course, the one with the better units have a higher chance of winning, but for once, these odds are far lower than on an open field, as it is way easier to catch the enemy off guard here. So if your scouting ability is strong enough, you'll win like 8 out of 10 engagements. If you don't, luck plays a way higher importance in terms of how you deploy from each other. But with that said, goodbye.